Welcome to the second session of this symposium, the ethics and book repair. What's the big deal? So we will now move from the content of the book to the, history and evidences given by its physical form, and discuss the perhaps difficult question of how to think when a book is in need of renovation. When we were planning this session, the working title was something like, when you own a rare book, what are you allowed to do with it? And from a legal aspect, perhaps the question might be simple. If you're a private owner of a rare book, I guess legally you can do almost whatever you want. You will not be charged for rebinding it. You will not be charged for taking something out. You may not be able to export it, but you can probably throw it away. But from an ethical point of view, of course, the answer is a bit more difficult. So how much can we alteration, and use a more rough word, how much manipulation of a book binding can we allow ourselves to do in the name of preservation or for making it more saleable or increasing a value? And two simple examples, if we have, for say, a very fine 16th century binding that has never been repaired, has never been altered, nothing has been made to it, and suddenly someone drop it on the floor and the front board get loose. What shall we do? Is that a part of the book's history that the front board is loose? Or shall we be the first one in its 400 years history to make a renovation to it? Or the temptations can be great in the trade. We have I guess, quite familiar situation when we have two copies of the same book. One is in a very fine contemporary binding, and very nice, but it lacks a great frontispiece. And we have another copy, which is very tired, later binding, and doesn't look very good, but it have the frontispiece. And how tempting can it not be to move the frontispiece from the one copy to the other? But instead of making one saleable copy, we are perhaps destroying two historical artifacts. These, and a better example of how we can think, is the theme for this session. And first, we shall listen to a presentation on what is ethics in book conservation by Natasha Herman from Redbone Bindery and STILT book Cradles, of which you can see in the far end of this room, and who has taught ethics and approaches to heritage conservation as a guest lecturer at several universities, and also give lectures around the world on ethics in book conservation and book binding. And in the panel, we also have the principal collection curator, Dr. Anna Walsh, from the State Library Victoria in Melbourne, who specialized in medieval and modern book culture and in the history of collections. And she will give a view from the rare book library world, and also from the world of booksellers and collectors, you can say. We have Nicolas Mallet, bookseller from Paris, with Libraire Mallet, and also a member of the ILAB committee. So, welcome, and now I give the word to Natasha.
Good afternoon. It's such a pleasure to be here. Thank you to ILAB for inviting me to talk about my favorite topic, ethics and book repair. Sorry. Is that better? Can you hear me? Great. Okay. So when I was a baby, somebody gave me a stuffed toy dog, and I loved that dog. I took it with me everywhere. And one day, my family went to New York City on a bus, and I took the dog with me, of course. And I wasn't paying attention. The dog fell out of my bag onto the floor of the bus. I didn't notice until I got into the hotel room afterwards, and I spent the whole trip just completely distraught. Lost my cuddly toy dog. Move on to the. So, babies, right after they connect with their mothers, they have this weird proclivity to connect with objects, so this, well, basically it's a psychologist who study these connections, but as a book conservator, I think my primary job is to care for these connections that we have with these inanimate objects. So, unlike with my cuddly toy dog, who nobody really cared about but myself, sad but true, most of these book objects that we care for are cared for by a collective of people. And when you have a collective of people caring for the same thing, they often have different reasons for caring about those things, which of course leads to sometimes disagreements, which leads to us having to figure out ways to try to find consensus or find agreement amongst disagreement. So in conservation, basically my profession is heritage conservation of material objects, but the code of ethics that we use basically covers that whole area from paintings to musical instruments. But I'm going to now give you a whole bunch of examples of how the principles within that generalized code apply specifically to books. Okay, so first, the first principle in the code that I actually think it's the most important overarching principle. It's a principle that deals with meaning and integrity in books. And it talks about our responsibility as book conservators to foster an informed respect of 4 different aspects of the book. One is the physical aspect of the book. Then we have the conceptual aspect, the historical aspect, and the aesthetic aspect. So those 4 things are equally important in this particular principle. How does that play out actually on books? Well, let's take a look at this example. So I think I should be looking here and then you can hear me. So on the left, and then I can't tell which is left. Yeah. On the left, we have a 2-volume set. Volume 2, for whatever reason, is deeply damaged. And on the right, you can see that I have repaired Volume 2 to look somewhat like Volume 1. So if we go back to what we're supposed to be respecting, the physical. Have I respected the physical integrity of this book? Well, one could argue that I have, in the sense that now the Volume 2 can actually be perused, so one could make a valid argument about that. Then we have conceptual. Well, that's an interesting one. If we assume that the concept of book is to read book, then one could argue that I have done honor to the conceptual value of that book. But be careful. Books, of course, were born usually and they're designed to be read, but that doesn't mean that the book today, the historical book, is used primarily as a reading device. Sometimes it's an exhibition thing. Sometimes it has just iconic or historical value outside of the value of the book object to read. So it's not necessarily always a ready-made argument. Then we go back to historical. Well, let's look at this. As you can see, there was no original spine on Volume 2. I made it up. That whole thing is completely new. I made it in the style of Volume 1 because, in a sense, that creates kind of a holistic object, but it's fake, let's be honest. What I did do in terms of respecting the historical is retain all other original material, so the boards are original. The historical design is in keeping with Volume 1, so one could make maybe a little bit more difficult argument for me having respected the historical aspect. And then finally we have the aesthetic, and that's always a difficult one. if your aesthetic, if you value the aesthetic of book set, so volume 1, volume 2 together looking the same, that's an aesthetic. And then you can say that I've definitely honored this, right? In putting the new reback on volume 2. Some people, myself included, which is a little weird as a book conservator, I quite like the aesthetic of the broken, the aesthetic of the ruined, and I think that that's not uncommon. And if that is your aesthetic, then I've kind of really ruined it. You can see how difficult this is, right? Because it depends on what you're talking about. Ultimately, when it comes to these 4 aspects, what we're trying to do is address them and pay attention to them. It doesn't mean that we can address them all equally. And then we're going to have to look into how can we create argumentation for why we've addressed certain aspects over other aspects. And I'll come to that in a moment. Okay, so the next principle I'm going to look at is the principle of reversibility. This is quite important in conservation. The word reversibility is now being, the idea of removability might be a more apt term to use, but the idea is whatever I add to a book or any changes that I made, physical changes that I make, should be as easy as possible to remove if necessary. Idea being, if somebody in 50 years looks at my work and says, oh, that's not great, at least they have the opportunity to remove it. How does that look? Well, let's take our example again. On the new reback, what I've done is I've resewn the book. You can always remove sewing just by snipping the thread, so that can be reversed. I've put a new lining on the spine of the book. I use water-soluble adhesive, so it's relatively easy with a little bit of moisture to peel that lining off. And then the hollowback reback that I've put on, also using water-soluble adhesive. So with a little bit more difficulty, that can be, actually it can be cut out and slightly removed with moisture. However, there's always going to be marks. So completely reversible, it never will be. There will always be traces of the fact that I have done something to it. That's just the nature of intervening physically into a book. Okay, then we have this idea of original material. So we have to keep all original material unless 2 things. One, we have a really good argument for why that original material is somehow doing greater harm to a greater portion of that whole book object. So that's one reason why we might be justified to remove original material. And the other is if somehow that original material is interfering with these 4 important aspects, right? The historic, aesthetic, conceptual, or physical integrity. How does that play out? Well, here, for example, so I have removed, the only thing that I've removed from this book to reback it are the threads, the original sewing threads, and the acidic spine lining. You can imagine the acidic spine lining, removing it and replacing it with an acid-free buffered spine lining is a smart thing to do, so I feel as though I'm justified in having done that. Other than that, nothing else was removed here. I've added, but I haven't removed. Okay, then we have preventive conservation. Basically, you can see this as anything I can control that's around the book. So without intervening and cutting into or removing or adding to the book itself, what can I do to preserve this book for future generations by controlling the environment, controlling the amount of light that's shining on the book, controlling, for instance, like storage and exhibition, packing, transportation, anything that I can do to safeguard this book without actually intervening in the book. And actually, interestingly, you can see that the code says that it's incumbent upon me to recognize the critical importance of preventive conservation as the most effective means of promoting long-term preservation. So what the code is saying is, first, I should really be looking at what can I do around this book before I start cutting into it. Okay, so interestingly, in my profession, I've been doing this for 25 years now. The first 20 years was really all about intervening, cutting into the book. But I noticed that more and more books were coming into my studio to be repaired precisely because they were at risk. They had broken during transportation or during exhibition, and I would see repeat failures because of bad handling. And so I started a second business in basically designing supports for books so that we could eliminate some of that risk. That's just preventive conservation. It's just a smart way of eliminating work coming into my studio, which basically renders me obsolete, but anyway. Okay, this is a really interesting one, and I think it's one that people maybe are a little unaware of outside of the conservation community, and even sometimes within the conservation community, social use. So it's our responsibility to understand the social use of a book object and then be able to, and then intervene as necessary given the context of the social use. So thinking about context, this is a really important one, and I think that one that's underappreciated. So if you look at this guy, he's basically doing everything wrong. Whether you're a librarian or a conservator, you're like, oh, nothing is right about what he's doing, right? And yet, it's not only is it a valid social use of the book, it's like the birth of the book was made for this exact situation. So social use it is, and if this man is to be allowed to continue to use his book in this valid social context, I have to figure out ways to allow that to happen and still keep the book relatively safe. And that's a balance. Here's another recognizable social use of the book. At book fairs, books are at risk of all sorts of things. Again, that's why I started business number 2. And yet, it's such an important social use of the book, right? People moving around the book so that they can start and add to their collections, which eventually go into institutional collections, which becomes our collective cultural heritage. So without it, there's an awful lot less of the thing that we care about. So it's incumbent upon me to be able to foster social use situations like this and make sure that the books are still relatively safe within those situations. Okay, integration of losses. I'm sure you guys are all very curious about this one. So it's up to, if we're going to add material, so for instance, that spine on the book that I added, I have to do it without fraudulent intent to the minimum extent necessary. These are the things I have to argue in order to conduct a treatment like the one I did. Any restoration or reconstruction, anything that I added to it has to be detectable, though it need not be conspicuous. So this is a very sort of gray area topic. When you look at this, you can see the first problem is like, who gets to decide that it's recognizable, right? If you had Nicholas Pickwoad come in within 2.5 seconds, he'd be like, yep, that's a reback with the original boards. They could tell exactly when it was done by whom. And yet, if you grab like a teenager off the street, they can barely say, oh, it's volume 2, let alone that it's been rebacked. So it's very difficult to figure out who my audience is to be able to do a repair and know that it's a relatively recognizable repair. Oops, sorry. So that leads to, okay, if that's the truth, if that is that difficult, how can I mitigate against this? What are my tools to deal with that? And the only really useful one is documentation. It's incumbent upon us to write down everything that we've done, the materials and adhesives that we've used, pictorial records before, during, after, so that basically we're not lying, we're not pulling the wool over anybody's eyes. I've been completely honest about what exactly that I have done. And in that documentation, I will do something like, well, I've blended this original spine so that it's a little less obtrusive as a repair. I'm doing that, for instance, because the aesthetics of a whole book was really important in this particular context. Therefore, I've justified what I'm doing. So you can see that you can play with these different principles, put them together, create argumentation, document it, and that's really the best that we can do in a complex world. Okay, so great, all of these principles, right? You've seen a little bit how I dance with the principles to kind of make them work in a particular context, but there are always going to be issues. Things are going to rub against one another, and you're going to have people who get upset or angry, or we're going to have debates. really common thing that happens in my field is when we've got values that people share, but that the norms, the way that they express these values, can be very different. So in these two pictures, on the left, you see a researcher who's, well, basically the two pictures, both of these people, we can say that they both love their books, right? They both value book heritage. And yet the people on the right are, their norm, their way of showing that is by not touching the book, by having one book at a time, by having it delivered to them and then brought back safely into a depot. On the right, you can see that this woman needs to be surrounded by her book collection in order to really feel the value of wanting to keep book heritage. So values are the same, norms, the way they practice those values can be very different. And then you can immediately start to imagine what the person on the right is going to be saying to the ones on the left. Oh, you're so clinical. You don't really love your books. You don't see the book as a collection. You just see it as an individual object. And the people on the right will be like, oh, those piles of books, right? Like and they can argue for quite a long time about who's doing it right. Let's look at these examples again. The woman on the left, the researcher, she might prefer actually to have the book unrestored. Why? Because maybe the unrestored second volume says something about why the second volume was way more important to read than the first volume, who knows? And also the way she's practicing using her book is such that it won't really matter if this thing has come unsewn because no pages are going to be lost. Maybe it'll be boxed and brought in very carefully. The woman on the right, on the other hand, really needs the book to be restored in this way, right? Because she's going to be piling it up on the floor, surrounded by all of her loved book objects. And if the pages aren't properly sewn, we're going to lose the pages. And so between norms and values, you can see there's quite a big difference in how you're going to treat, how you might want to treat a book. And the other place where there can be arguments is around cultural issues. So this is an example of a colleague of mine who was looking at she was looking at these wampum beads. Wampum beads actually, the colonists thought that they were just meant as decorative items and gift items. Well, it turns out that the people who make them use them as a way to record and remember and communicate really important information. Sounds kind of familiar, right? A little bit like book. So you can imagine that if somebody if somebody wanted to have their book restored and they brought it to me, but I don't know anything about books because I don't come from a culture of books, and I see that like the first 10 pages are torn, but there's 200 other pages. I might just say, well, we don't need these first 5 pages, right? Because we have all these other pages. So, I mean, this is a bit of an extreme example, but you can imagine that if you don't understand the cultural context of where the thing comes from, you can make some pretty major mistakes. So how do we mitigate against these big problems? Well, first of all, the Code of Ethics makes it very clear that it's our responsibility to pay an awful lot of attention to cultural issues and consult the proper people when possible. And it's relatively easy to do this. So if we talk about how we want to move forward with the book with the right people, so invite the right stakeholders to the discussion, listen to what they have to say, document the reasoning, and then reflect on our results, check and see like what worked and what didn't and why, where do the arguments come from, what can I do in the future to mitigate against those things. I think, honestly, there's not all that much in terms of book restoration that I would say is honestly a bad restoration or a good restoration. Everything is very, very gray area. But the one thing I can say for certain is that the good restoration is one that's been deliberated upon, where it's been thought about and discussed. So that's it. I hope some of these principles gives us some food for discussion.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Many principles to take care of, and now we heard the principle of the conservator's code of ethics, which I guess is something that conservators around the world have agreed upon, that this is what we will follow. And is this are this principle and this code of ethics also something that the rare book libraries agree upon, like a code of ethics for rare book libraries? It's about the same, or?
Thank you, and thank you, Natasha, for a wonderful presentation. I would say there's not perhaps as formalized a document as a code of ethics amongst rare books librarians, but certainly because we are guided in our care of the collections by our conservation colleagues, that we are in effect following the conservation code of ethics, even without knowing it at times. And I think there was so much of what you talked about, Natasha, that's so familiar to me in everyday conversations with our specialist book conservators at the State Library. And in fact, one just the other day that a book was donated to us that has been the subject of the donor's research for quite a number of years before he made the decision to donate it. It's a 1610 Geneva Bible published by the Barkers in London, but bound and sold by Andrew Hart in Edinburgh. It had become a family Bible and is absolutely read to shreds. It's in pieces, literally. The spine had previously already been rebacked, and that too has failed. And I handed it over carefully to our conservators and said, "What can you do? What can you do for my patient? Let's talk about what the options are." And the first conversation I had with Ian Cox, our very experienced book conservator, he said, "Anna, I'm sorry, there's nothing to be done for this book. The best we can do is store it carefully." And immediately I must have looked disappointed, because he said, "Oh, I don't want to see you look sad or the donor look sad. So let's talk further." And our discussion really did center around those principles of what is the purpose of a restoration or a conservation treatment were it to be undertaken. Does this book need to be read as a codex, as a bound codex? What information would be lost if we were to put it back together in a way that somehow lost evidence of its very intensive use by families over the centuries? And in the end, we came to a compromise position, which I think is generally what happens in these conversations between curators, librarians, and conservators, is that you find a middle path between the needs of the book and its environment within the collection in terms of how much access will it have. Can it be digitized as another form of preventative conservation? And in this case, that meant a decision that, yes, we probably will, he will reback it, retain the original boards. He said at first, but we wouldn't want to reback it. I said, it's already been rebacked at least once, so there's conversations too around how you treat previous conservation treatments. And in the end, we came to a sort of decision that will make the book usable for someone wanting to handle it as a book, but will preserve the integrity, and I think that's a really interesting and important word, the integrity of it in its codex form, but also the integrity of its social history as a very used, worn item with incredibly lovely eroded paper edges that are totally curved and smooth, like a rock on a beach, rather than a sharp, fresh corner.
Thank you. And all these, of course, the preservation principles, but in the trade, we perhaps also have some other considerations to take care. So, and we also have in the ILAB Code of Ethics, where it said that all restorations that should be clearly made known, but we don't have anything really of what one should do and how. So, can you comment to that, Nicholas?
Just a quick comment. It's difficult for us booksellers because we have different kind of customers, if I may. We work with private collectors. We work also with curators, librarians, and very often they don't want the same thing. So sometimes a private collector, he will want a perfect book with a lot of restorations, and maybe he won't care about the ethic. I mean, it's his problem, the private collector. He will decide what he wants to do. But us, we also work with libraries, and also we have our own ethic. So it depends of the bookseller and if you work with a a curator with a library, you don't make the same decision. So you have to make choices. But I will speak a little of that in my own speech.
And also maybe one can say that a market, it can also be somewhat self-regulating, as books that are in original condition, they are not being repaired, becoming more and more scarce, and then they also rise in price, and then there is not that much need to make modern renovations or adding spines, spine titles, etc. It's better to keep them in their original worn condition, that even is more attractive.
But it has not always been the case. It's an historical problem. But also, I will speak a bit of that. After. When I make the speech, I will.
Okay. and does it also, but these principles, are there differences from the library? Are there differences between different cultures, different countries, or have all the same agreements that?
I wish I was worldly enough to be able to answer that fully, but I think certainly thinking about an Australian context, libraries have been relatively slow to understand the value of, contemporary or early bindings, and to take that very conservative approach to interventions to books. So, I think that collections that have, or important books that have come into a library like the State Library here, if they came in the 1950s and they were in a pretty, broken down 16th century binding, off with the binding, straight to the bindery, rebound in a totally unsympathetic, just functional binding. And that part of that is the type of institution that this library is, which is that it's a public collection. It has a very strong sense of purpose in being a place for everybody to come and educate themselves. So this library, for instance, its founder was very much against the idea of rare books, that we shouldn't have books that are only acquired for their antiquarian interest or beauty. And that has held sway for a long time, I think, until much more recently, only really from the 1960s onwards, when Australian librarians began to learn from European and international counterparts about how to care for special collections in that way. And so I think there has been a very big culture shift within Australia, certainly. And I have come into this profession in a time where I can't imagine that we would ever do something like rebind a 15th century book without a very, very good reason. And even if we did, all the parts of the previous binding would be kept. And as Natasha talked about, documentation as a very important part of that process, I would agree and would say that is that's in a way the backup of any decisions that are made, is that they are documented and that information accompanies the book into its future.
Yeah, because we all know that the principles have changed a lot during time. And that's why it may be so important with the reversibility, that we don't know in what the future would like to have as a principles for renovation. Does
this work? No. Now? Yeah, there we are. So actually, it's quite a recent history that we've had these principles written down in a code. So started in the general heritage was starting to develop these principles in the 1920s and 30s, and then it kind of trickled down into heritage material heritage conservation in the 1960s, when these codes. I don't know if you saw some of the dates of the various country codes. From the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and now things are being revised to include cultural issues and that sort of thing. So there's constant revisions to the code, and also you can see that there are trends in style and even aesthetics based on things like prior to the internet, people went to the library to actually read the book, and now that everything's being digitized, this sense of, or an understanding of originality in book structures and book bindings have become much more important to preserve. So you can see that there are trends in how we approach the complex decisions that we're making over time, regardless of the principles. Yeah.
Yeah, I would absolutely. And as someone, I mean, my background's as a historian, sort of focusing on book culture and book materiality. And again, that seems sort of quite normal to someone of my generation, but the material turn, as academics would talk about, is something that's quite recent in terms of people who study texts have not always been interested in the materiality of those texts, whereas now that's a central question. And you could throw a dart and hit a project that's about marginalia these days. That's everyone's interested in originality, copy specific, and I think that too is a response to digitization. Is that the more widely available texts are digitally, the more interesting the specific copy is to researchers.
Yeah. I think the other thing that's happening is we've got the Instagram culture, right? Kids who are growing up not touching anything, and they find it particularly fascinating to touch a book, let alone some of this historical stuff. And so it's trickling down as it goes through in Instagram. There are kids coming into libraries saying, "I actually want to touch that real thing," and they hyper value the original materiality of it. Yeah.
Now, time is unfortunately running very fast. So, are there any questions?
Yeah, no, don't worry. I have a little speech to do. You two after?
I can, but I was no.
Okay, no. So I prepared a little speech, quick one, like 5 minutes to answer the questions that's for the round table. But I don't know exactly how much time we have, so I will be quick. So it's a way to answer what we were telling about, and yeah, just to be. It was just to give you the side of. The point of view of a bookseller in 5 minutes on the question, and maybe after you will ask a question to us, of course. Yes, I'm a bookseller in Paris, and I'm also a publisher. I publish books about books, and most recently I published a book on the topic of paper, where there is a chapter about restoration and the ethics of restoration. And so it's something that matters deeply to me as a bookseller. So today I speak as a professional and as a bookseller, and what I will say, I'm not speaking as for the ILAB, I'm speaking as myself, but I think it's clearly important to say that we have an ILAB code of usages and customs, as you say, and in that code it's written, description and disclosure, point 3, members should be responsible for the accurate identification and description of all material offered for sale. All defects, significant restoration and sophistication or omissions should be clearly noted and made known to those to whom the material is offered or sold. So, what I will share now are my own reflection, my own views as a professional. So, yes, in the book trades, the ethical principles guiding the preservation of books often come into tension with commercial interest and personal beliefs. Personally, I make it a point of honor to disclose all restorations. As a dealer, I regularly work with restorers. And what seems the most important to me is that restoration should be, as often as possible, reversible, so that the object can be returned to its previous state. This is especially relevant when reattaching a cover or repairing paper. Such work should be as reversible as possible and, of course, clearly disclosed. when it comes to bindings, I cannot support what some dealers have done for years. Taking a very damaged binding, missing much of its decoration, and restoring it to a nearly new appearance. To me, this raises a question of integrity. Is it an imitation, a fake, or a restoration? I believe we must be reasonable and transparent about each stage of restoration. That said, I'm well aware that practices have varied greatly over time, depending on the era and also the country. Restoration is a cultural practice shaped by differing viewpoints and national standards, by different restoration traditions. Even collectors' tastes vary by country. In France, collectors often prefer a book in perfect condition, bound, for example, in an 18th century Morocco, and will have it restored accordingly. The Anglo-Saxon market is generally less obsessed with perfection through restoration. It's a different test. As a dealer, I mostly deal in annotated books from the 16th century or the 15th century. That is the core of my work. The main types of restoration I carry out for annotated books are preserving the integrity of the binding with reversible techniques and restoring paper, but only when damages threaten the long-term preservation or integrity of the book. Otherwise, I don't intervene. Also, I would like to add that restoration had changed a lot over the centuries. I find it especially difficult to accept the way books were restored in the 19th century in France, trimming the margins to make the book look clean at the cost of losing annotations. That is a disaster. Books also that have been overwashed, where the paper looks brand new, it's another catastrophe. Today, it is acceptable, I think, to lightly wash the paper with water to remove significant stains, if that contributes to the long-term preservation of the work. Otherwise, we leave it alone. So, according to myself, the typical 19th century bibliophiles restoration in France, trimmed margins, new Morocco binding, washed pages, might produce a beautiful book if it's what you like, but it results in a major loss of information. And just to conclude quickly, yeah, of course, and also if you suppress the original on papers, you will lack information. So I'm glad that today these practices have largely fallen out of favor. So not entirely. And what matters most to me is preserving the original binding, the original end papers, and Oresco reference, the margins and the annotations. The idea is to pass on the book as close to its original state as possible, with full transparency and no deception. This is how books will continue to be passed down from generation to generation, both in private collection and in libraries.
Thank you very much, Nicolas.